Dawn was still gray over the cold fields of northern France when the quiet was broken by the low rumble of engines. The date was August 19th, 1944. Thin mist hung over the hedgerows near the town of Chambois, a small place that most people had never heard of before the war. German tank crews of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, had spent the night moving through narrow farm roads, trying to escape a tightening Allied trap.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
Their Panther and Panzer IV tanks rolled slowly between the thick hedgerows, steel tracks grinding against damp soil. The men inside the turrets believed the worst threat above them was Allied artillery. What they did not know was that high above the morning clouds, American pilots were already hunting them. Inside the lead Panther tank, Oberleutnant Karl Brenner leaned forward, scanning the road through his binoculars. Brenner was a veteran tanker who had fought on the Eastern Front. He had seen Soviet T-34s rush across frozen fields and had survived the brutal battles near Kursk the year before. Compared to that chaos, this quiet French countryside felt strangely calm. His crew moved carefully, keeping distance between vehicles as they rolled through the narrow lane bordered by thick hedges. Brenner's biggest concern was Allied fighter bombers, but the sky looked empty. Just pale clouds drifting in the early morning light. But at that same moment, more than 2,000 meters above them, Lieutenant Commander Hamilton McWhorter Jr. of the United States Navy was watching the ground through the canopy of his aircraft. McWhorter flew an F6F Hellcat, one of the most powerful carrier-based fighters of the war. The aircraft had been designed for dogfights over the Pacific, but now many Hellcats were operating over Europe to support Allied forces pushing through France. McWhorter's squadron had taken off earlier that morning from a temporary Allied airstrip near Cherbourg. Their mission was simple: find German armor and destroy it. The Hellcat was a massive aircraft compared to many fighters of the time. Powered by a Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine producing more than 2,000 horsepower, the plane could dive fast and carry heavy weapons. Under its wings were rockets and bombs designed to punch through tank armor. Each Hellcat also carried 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns that could tear apart trucks, fuel convoys, and exposed infantry in seconds. As McWhorter scanned the countryside below, he suddenly spotted something moving along a narrow road. At first it looked like small, dark shapes between hedgerows. Then sunlight reflected off steel. Tanks. "Armor on the road," McWhorter said calmly into his radio. His wingmen immediately shifted formation. The American pilots had learned something important during the fighting in Normandy. German tanks were dangerous on open ground, but when they moved along narrow roads, trapped between hedgerows, they became perfect targets for air attack. And the Hellcat was extremely good at attacking from above. McWhorter pushed the nose of his aircraft downward. The Hellcat began a steep dive. Below, the German column continued moving slowly. Brenner's Panther led 5 other tanks and several armored half-tracks carrying infantry. The road twisted through farms and orchards, limiting visibility. Brenner knew they had to reach the Seine River before Allied forces completely closed the gap. Fuel was already running low, and many units had been destroyed during the chaotic retreat after the breakout from Normandy. Suddenly, the quiet morning shattered. A screaming sound tore through the sky. Brenner looked up instinctively. At first he saw nothing. Then the sunlight caught the dark shape of an aircraft, diving almost straight down. "Flugzeug!" someone shouted from one of the half-tracks. But by the time the warning spread, it was already too late. McWhorter's Hellcat roared downward at more than 400 miles per hour. The aircraft's engine thundered as he lined up the lead Panther in his gun sight. At around 1,500 feet, he fired his rockets. The weapons streaked away from the wings, leaving trails of smoke. The rockets slammed into the road beside the Panther. The explosion lifted dirt, fire, and metal into the air. Brenner felt the shock waves slam into his tank like a giant hammer. The vehicle rocked violently as debris rained down on the turret. His gunner shouted something over the intercom, but the words were drowned out by the deafening blast outside. Then the machine guns opened up. McWhorter held the trigger as his 6 Browning machine guns spat streams of heavy rounds into the German column. Bullets smashed into half-tracks, shattered windshields, and tore through exposed soldiers scrambling for cover. The Hellcat roared over the road and pulled sharply upward. Within seconds, 3 more Hellcats followed the same dive path. The German column was suddenly trapped in chaos. Panzer crews tried to rotate their turrets upward, but tank guns were not designed to hit fast-moving aircraft diving from steep angles. Some machine gunners fired wildly into the sky, but the Hellcats were already climbing away before the Germans could react. Brenner wiped dust from his face and peered through his periscope. One of the half-tracks behind him was burning fiercely. Soldiers ran from the flames while ammunition inside the vehicle detonated with sharp cracks. Another tank had stopped moving completely. Then he heard the scream again. More aircraft diving. Above the battlefield, the American pilots circled like hawks. The Hellcat's strength was not just speed or firepower, it was durability. The aircraft had thick armor around the cockpit and a strong airframe that allowed pilots to dive steeply without fear of losing control. That meant they could attack repeatedly. McWhorter rolled his Hellcat back into another dive. This time he aimed for the second Panther in the column. The German tank commander, Feldwebel Otto Weber, spotted the aircraft seconds before impact. He shouted for the driver to move, but there was nowhere to go. The road was blocked by vehicles ahead and hedgerows on both sides. McWhorter fired again. 2 rockets slammed into the ground beside Weber's tank. The blast tore off one of the tracks and flipped the vehicle partly onto its side. Flames burst from the engine compartment as fuel ignited. Within less than 3 minutes, the entire German column had been scattered. Some tanks tried to reverse into nearby fields, but the soft soil made movement slow. Others remained stuck on the narrow road. American aircraft kept circling and attacking in waves. For the German tankers, it felt like lightning striking from the sky again and again. But this moment was not random. It was part of a much larger strategy that had developed during the months after the Allied landings in Normandy. When the Allies landed on June 6, 1944, D-Day, they faced one major problem. German armored divisions were extremely dangerous. Units like the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and Panzer Lehr Division were equipped with powerful tanks, such as the Panther and Tiger. These vehicles had thick armor and deadly long-range guns that could destroy most Allied tanks before the Americans or British could even fire back. Instead of meeting German armor head-on, Allied commanders relied heavily on air power. Aircraft became the most effective tank killers on the battlefield. Fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt, Hawker Typhoon, and the Navy's F6F Hellcat hunted German vehicles across the French countryside. They attacked supply convoys, fuel trucks, artillery units, and armored columns trying to move between towns. German tank crews quickly learned that daytime movement could be deadly. By August 1944, the situation had become even worse for them. After the American breakout at Operation Cobra in late July, German forces began retreating eastward. But the retreat quickly turned into disaster when Allied armies tried to trap them in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. The pocket formed near the towns of Falaise, Trun, and Chambois. Thousands of German soldiers, tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces were squeezed into a shrinking corridor while Allied aircraft attacked them almost constantly. Lieutenant Commander McWhorter and his fellow Hellcat pilots were part of this effort. Throughout the day on August 19th, American and British aircraft flew hundreds of sorties over the pocket. They struck anything that moved. Columns of vehicles stretched for miles along dusty roads. Some were armored units trying to escape. Others were supply trucks packed with ammunition and wounded soldiers. Many vehicles were abandoned after running out of fuel. From the air, the battlefield looked like a long trail of destruction. Hellcats dived again and again, launching rockets and strafing the trapped convoys. For the German tankers on the ground, it was terrifying. Panzer Commander Karl Brenner watched as another Hellcat screamed down from the clouds. This time, the rockets hit the tank behind him directly. The explosion ripped open the turret and flames burst outward like a blowtorch. Brenner knew that inside the tank, the crew had almost no chance of survival. His driver tried to push the Panther into a nearby field to escape the road. The tank lurched forward, crashing through a wooden fence and grinding over crops. Brenner hoped the trees ahead might provide some cover from the aircraft, but the Hellcats were already circling again. High above, McWhorter spotted Brenner's tank moving off the road. He pushed the nose down once more. As the Hellcat dove, you can almost feel the pressure pushing against the pilot's chest. The ground rushes upward at frightening speed. The aircraft vibrates as wind resistance builds. McWhorter lined up the tank in his gun sight. This time he used the machine guns first. Streams of .50 caliber rounds hammered the Panther's engine deck. Armor-piercing bullets struck the thin metal covering the engine compartment. One round punctured a fuel line. Seconds later, smoke began pouring from the back of the tank. Inside the Panther, Brenner smelled burning oil. "Motorraum brennt!" the driver shouted. The engine compartment was on fire. Brenner ordered the crew to abandon the tank. The men scrambled out of the turret and jumped into the field just as another rocket exploded nearby. Dirt and fragments blasted across the ground. When Brenner looked back, his Panther was already burning. Around him, the entire landscape had turned into a graveyard of vehicles. Burning trucks filled the air with thick black smoke. Ammunition exploded in random bursts. Dead horses from destroyed wagons lay scattered along the road. And above it all, the Hellcats continued circling. But the destruction unfolding around Chambois that day was only a small part of a much larger catastrophe for the German army. By mid-August 1944, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commander of Army Group B, knew the situation in Normandy had become nearly impossible. Allied forces had broken through German defensive lines and were now advancing rapidly from several directions. American forces under General George S. Patton were pushing east with incredible speed, while Canadian and Polish units were moving south from Falaise. This created a deadly trap. German divisions were suddenly squeezed into a narrow corridor barely a few kilometers wide. Roads were packed with retreating vehicles, fuel trucks, artillery tractors, tanks, ambulances, and horse-drawn wagons all struggled to move along the same narrow routes. Many drivers had not slept for days. Engines overheated. Fuel ran out. Broken vehicles were pushed into ditches to clear the road. From the air, Allied pilots could see everything. The Hellcat pilots flying above the pocket often described the scene as something they had never witnessed before. Long lines of vehicles stretched across the countryside like dark scars on the landscape. Smoke rose from dozens of burning trucks. Sometimes entire columns were frozen in place because a single destroyed vehicle blocked the road. That made them perfect targets. McWhorter and his squadron continued their patrols throughout the afternoon. Each time they spotted movement, they attacked again. Rockets streaked downward. Machine guns roared. Vehicles exploded or burst into flames. One Hellcat pilot later described seeing so many destroyed trucks that the road itself disappeared beneath the wreckage. For the soldiers on the ground, the noise never stopped. The constant roar of aircraft engines echoed through the valley. Even when one wave of fighters left, another soon appeared in the distance. German anti-aircraft units tried to fight back. Flak guns fired bursts of black smoke into the sky. Tracer rounds streaked upward from machine guns mounted on half-tracks. But the Hellcats attacked quickly and from steep angles, making them extremely hard to hit. Most of the time, the aircraft were already climbing away before the gunners could adjust their aim. By the evening of August 19th, the German forces trapped in the Falaise Pocket had suffered catastrophic losses. Historians estimate that more than 10,000 German soldiers were killed during the final days of the pocket. Tens of thousands more were captured. Hundreds of tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery pieces were destroyed or abandoned. Air power played a major role in that destruction. Pilots like Hamilton McWhorter and his fellow aviators had turned the skies above Normandy into a deadly hunting ground. For German tank crews, the war had changed. Earlier in the conflict, tanks had dominated the battlefield. German blitzkrieg tactics had relied on fast-moving armored columns supported by aircraft. But by 1944, the balance had shifted. Now the Allied air forces ruled the sky. Any armored unit moving in daylight risked sudden attack. German soldiers began traveling mostly at night whenever possible. Tanks were hidden under trees or inside barns during the day to avoid detection from the air. But during the chaotic retreat from Normandy, many units had no choice but to move during daylight hours. That was when the Hellcats struck like lightning. Months later, Lieutenant Commander Hamilton McWhorter would remember the missions over France as some of the most intense flying of his career. McWhorter had already become one of the Navy's top fighter aces during the war in the Pacific, scoring numerous victories against Japanese aircraft. But the missions over Europe were different. Instead of dogfighting enemy fighters, the pilots spent long hours searching for targets on the ground. They had to identify tanks, trucks, and artillery positions while flying at high speed. Then they had to dive into heavy anti-aircraft fire to destroy those targets. Despite the danger, the Hellcat proved extremely effective. Its strong armor protected pilots from ground fire. Its powerful engine allowed quick climbs after each attack. And its heavy weapons could devastate vehicles caught in the open. German soldiers gave Allied fighter bombers a nickname during the campaign in France. They called them Chambois, short for Jagdbomber. Whenever someone shouted, "Jabo," soldiers would dive for cover immediately, because they knew what was coming next. The scream of diving aircraft, the roar of rockets, and the sudden explosions that could destroy a tank in seconds. For the German tank crews retreating through Normandy in August 1944, the sky had become the most dangerous battlefield of all. And the Hellcats kept coming. Even today, when historians walk through the quiet fields around Falaise and Chambois, they still find pieces of that battle. Rusted fragments of armor, twisted metal from destroyed vehicles, and sometimes unexploded ammunition buried in the soil. These silent remnants tell the story of those chaotic days, days when armored columns tried desperately to escape, days when the sky above them thundered with aircraft, and days when American Hellcats struck like lightning from the clouds, changing the fate of thousands of soldiers on the ground.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.